So welcome everybody. I'm Professor Debbie Bechtel. I'm acting as the interim director of the SPARE program while Cynthia Godsow's on sabbatical. We have a really interesting program today, and the students who've coordinated the panel are going to introduce the speakers shortly. Just to start with a few announcements, I wanted to see if Danielle may have something.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Sorkin, the Executive Director of the Public Service Law Center, known to many of our students. Just wanted to remind you that you should be, if you haven't found your summer placement yet, you should definitely be coming in to meet with either me or Jackie. We also do have some exciting to me, programming coming up, and I'm going to pass the baton to Jackie, the virtual baton, and she'll tell you about our program on Thursday.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, tomorrow we're doing our program on postgrad fellowships, which hopefully you've heard something about. This is a really great program, especially for 2Ls to try to make. Hopefully, I think we'll record it. So if you can't make it, it's okay. But if you could join us, these are postgrad fellowships, a great opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door in some fields that tend not to have a ton of entry-level opportunities, civil rights, environment, labor and employment, stuff like that, where it can be kind of hard as a graduating a new lawyer to get your first job. And these fellowships give you that entry point. So if you can make it, it's tomorrow at 12:45. The Zoom link is on BLS Connect and Canvas. Hope to see you there. And if you can't make it, you can always come in and chat with me or Danielle about these programs. Thanks.
Thanks. Stacy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Kaplow, and I have two different announcements to make. One really only applying to people who are not doing a SPARE fellowship this summer, but who are looking for other fellowship opportunities. Just to let you know, through Danielle's office, we are offering an immigration law fellowship. So if any of you do not have funding through other sources, including SPARE, but would like to have a paid fellowship over the summer to do immigration work, contact Danielle with your thoughts, and I'm happy to help as well. But a more global announcement is that on March 16th, we're going to be starting our information dissemination for clinics for next fall. So particularly for those of you who are 1Ls and have been just anxious to learn about clinical opportunities for next year, you should plan to attend. Obviously, they'll be online. 2 information sessions on the 16th. Those sessions will be the general clinics, both taught in-house and also the clinics that are taught by adjuncts. And then on the 18th, the session will focus on externships, both for the summer and next year, and sort of your general future plans about externships. They'll all be recorded in case you miss it, and they'll be held at lunch hour, 12:45. So stay tuned for the links. And then applications for the fall will be due on April 9th. The application form itself is available on BLS Connect on the clinics page. Easy to submit. Don't have to think about it right now, but in the future when you're ready to apply, that's how you will apply. And in between the 18th and the 9th, there'll be a bunch of small group sessions held by individual clinics. So you'll get information about how to sign up for those and attend as many of those as you want to find out more details, because our information session on the 16th and 18th will only be an hour, so there won't be a lot of detail that will be provided then. So you should feel free to log into any of the small group sessions and keep your eyes out for the schedules. They'll be posted and emailed, and you'll probably be tired of getting all the emails about clinic applications, because we don't want you to miss the deadlines. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you. And then as the SPARE Forum is coming up March 18th, and we've had a whole group of fellows and professors working on that. So Caitlin or Anjani are going to just say a few words about what we're planning there.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, just a reminder that the SPARE Forum is taking place on Thursday, March 18th. It's during the evening, so it's in the 4:30 p.m. time slot and should run until about 6:30 p.m. There's an invite out there that you should have received on February 25th, and it requests your RSVP by March 15th. So let any of us know if you have not received that, and we are happy to resend or get you that link. And the theme is public interest lawyering during the pandemic. And Sparrow Fellows Emily Ingram and Oren Silverman will be moderating the conversation. And Caitlin is going to talk a little bit more about who our really exciting speakers are.
Hi, everybody. So we have 6 great panelists that will be joining us for the symposium. They're all BLS alums and were Sparrow Fellows when they were at BLS. So they're listed in the invitation that you were sent, but just to give you a rundown of where they're coming from, we have people from the ACLU, the Bronx Defenders, Legal Aid Society, Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Los Angeles dependency lawyers, and then we have a recent grad, Patrick Gallagher, from the class of 2020. So he'll be speaking about his work now at Barger and Gaines, which is a small law firm, but also about his involvement with the Pandemic Employment Relief Clinic. So we're really excited about that. And if you have any questions, you can email me, Anjani, or Professor Bechtel.
Anybody else?
I actually have 2 very quick announcements. One, I am speaking with some members of the board of trustees to figure out ways in which, with the bar exam cycle coming up for July 2021, perhaps the alumni community can offer some sort of assistance, economic or otherwise, to those individuals who may not have the economic or locational privilege to take or purchase bar exam resources in comfort. So if that situation applies to you and you're graduating 3L Spare, it would be nice to have some of those comments before, as I meet with those trustees, to the extent that the school and indeed the recent alumni community can perhaps help with those challenges. The second thing is we're bringing candidates to campus very, very soon for our open academic success positions. And if you are interested in meeting those finalists, given the position's really, really important role and everything we do in our office and how we support those students who may need some extra help on the bar exam. If you're interested in that, please let me know and contact me offline. Thanks.
So I'll turn over to Professor Raghavan to introduce the students and start the panel.
Great, thank you all for coming. I really don't have a lot to add. So I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful Sparrow Fellows who put on a really excellent lunch panel today. And I want to thank our speakers for taking time out of their really busy schedules to be here with us. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Hi, everyone. My name's Cam Molyneux. I'm a Sparrow Fellow and a 2L. I'm one of the organizers of this event. So I'm just going to start out with introducing some of our speakers and their bios. So first we have Kat Welbeck, who uses she, her pronouns. She's the Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center, which is a national nonprofit organization that works to protect student loan borrowers through advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy. Kat's work primarily focuses on examining the student debt crisis through a lens of racial equity and economic justice. Prior to joining the SBPC, she worked for 5 years in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Office of Public Engagement and Community Liaison. Before she began her legal career, she taught 4th grade in Houston, Texas. And then second, we have Winston Berkman Breen, who uses he, him pronouns. He's the Director of Consumer Advocacy at the New York Department of Financial Services. In this role, he proposes and advances consumer protection policies and advises on consumer matters across the business unit. He is also the department's student loan advocate and works with its student protection unit staff and consumer advocates to respond to student loan borrower needs and to address emerging education finance issues. Prior to joining DFS, Winston worked in legal services with a focus on affirmative and defensive litigation related to debt collection, student loans, and foreclosure. He was a Justice Catalyst Fellow and staff attorney with the Consumer Protection Unit at NILAG and was a fellow with the Project on Predatory Student Lending at the Legal Services Center of Harvard Law School. He earned a JD and a Master of Public Administration from New York University and a BA from Tufts University. And now I'm going to turn over to Zach.
Hi, and I'm just going to be introducing Luke Herron, who uses the pronouns he, him. He's the managing editor of the Law and Political Economy blog and a PhD candidate at Yale Law School. He was previously the legal director of the Debt Collective, which he co-founded, and where he helped design legal and organizing strategies that led to tens of millions of dollars of canceled student loan debt. And I think I will be passing it off to Kat to get us started.
Hi, and Cam, thanks so much for that introduction. Hi again, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by thanking Cam, Raina, Zach, and Professor Raghavan for the opportunity to present today. Again, as Cam mentioned, I'm Kat Welbeck, Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Also, just one quick note before I dive in, my building is doing fire alarm testing. So if there's an alarm, I'm going to keep going, and please feel free to ignore. But like Cam said, we're a national nonprofit solely focused on alleviating the burden of student debt in this country. And much of my work as Civil Rights Counsel focuses on looking at the student debt crisis through a lens, an equity lens, and economic justice. So I'm super excited about today. And I also know that we'll probably talk a little bit more about policy and some policy solutions to a lot of the problems that we might be talking about during the panel. So what I'm going to try to do just in my remarks, I'm mostly going to talk a little bit about, where we are in student debt, and especially a lot of the racial disparities that we see, and try to save some of my my commentary on, conversations maybe about policy solutions, cancellation, whatever it may be towards the end. And questions. So I guess just to get it started, just talking a little bit about the breadth of this crisis. There are 45 million people in this country who owe at a collective $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. And so this makes student debt the second largest class of consumer debt outside of mortgages. And so what we really see is that the ripple effects of this crisis really just broadly reverberate across our communities, across our economy, because $1.7 trillion in debt, right? And so especially now, I think as we're grappling with one economic crisis before millions of families have really recovered from the last one, a lot of the devastation that we saw in the Great Recession, we really see that student debt really can exacerbate a lot of the ongoing economic fallout that we're seeing from the pandemic. So it's almost like we're dealing with dual crises. We're dealing with a public health crisis. We're dealing with an economic crisis on top of the fact that many people are still struggling and haven't recovered from a crisis, not too many years ago. And so what's, so interesting is that we're told that education is a tool for social mobility, but we see time and time again that student debt and the student debt crisis is really hampering economic opportunity for millions of student loan borrowers. And so what we see is that this debt is really casting a shadow over our communities, over our country. And so I really think it's really important just to take a step back as we're having this conversation about student debt, to really think about also how it's fueling economic, gender, racial inequality, and also it really inhibits asset accumulation, it accelerates wealth gaps, and it's just really carving out, it affects everyone, but it's still carving out what we see as kind of like a generational divide. And I also think as much of our national conversation in the past year has really, and thankfully in a way, focused on racial equity. I think it's, and how do we create a more equitable and just economy? I just really think that it's important that we don't overlook the student debt crisis, especially how we think about the longstanding effects of discriminatory economic policy, and how our student debt crisis then is a direct reflection of, and then continues to perpetuate systemic barriers of racial discrimination. So it's all really interwoven. And so one way that I like to talk about this is starting with the racial wealth gap, because I really think it helps show how this divide can become intergenerational. And I'll dig deep into a little bit of each of these a little bit later, but what we see is that primarily we see Black and Latino borrowers starting off with less household wealth. And so they're then taking on more debt to pay for school. So when they leave school with more debt, we see that cutting into opportunities for wealth creation down the line. And so what do we see then? Then when it's time to send their children to college, or, prepare for another generation, that cycle can often repeat. And so diving in a little bit deeper to what that looks like in terms of numbers. So what we see is that about 90% of Black students, about 72% of Latino students take on debt to pay for college. And that's in comparison to about 66% of their white peers. And so, like I was saying, if students are coming from households with less wealth, is that they're less likely to be able to draw on money from their families or seek support from their families to pay for college. And so that results in more debt. And then we also see, more hardships and repayment for a host of, we can imagine for a host of reasons. But so what we see is that even down the line is that we're also seeing that Black and Latino students are not paying down their debt at the same rate as their white peers. And so 20 years after starting college, the median Black borrower still owes 95% of his or her original student loan balance, while the median white borrower has paid down almost 95% of their original balance. And similarly, research says the same thing about Latino borrowers are still owing 83% of their original student loan balances compared to the median white borrower who's paid almost half their balance by that point. And so you can see, again, you're talking about earlier, how does that cut into opportunities for wealth building when we think about borrowers being able to own homes, to start businesses, all of those things. This debt really weighs on those opportunities for them to start building wealth and really trying to propel themselves. And then even more concerning is that we also see significant default in delinquency and default disparities. So within 6 years of starting school, 1 in 3 Black borrowers and 1 in 5 Latino borrowers have defaulted on a student loan compared to 1 in 10 white borrowers. And what we see is too, even as we look more broadly across the country, especially in segregated cities and segregated communities, we see that even Black borrowers are almost 5 times as likely to default as their white peers. And so this is really concerning too, because with default comes a lot of economic consequences in addition to negative credit reporting. Again, we're talking about these ideas about how student debt impairs wealth building and wealth creation. But when we also think about the ways that default and delinquency can even, have even more severe consequences for borrowers. So not only is it negative credit reporting, but it means that, borrowers may struggle to get a job because that might be on their credit report. They may have trouble renting a home or even maintaining a professional license. There are places where borrowers can have their license revoked for having loans in default. And then on top of that, thinking about borrowers who can have their wages garnished, their tax refunds withheld, or even their Social Security benefits offset. So all of these things we're already talking about, struggling, but then in addition to that, literally stripping money from struggling borrowers. And so as we're thinking about talking about, racial and economic justice and how do we touch on these head on, I really think about the importance of thinking about what are solutions to how we're protecting borrowers. What are we doing to center the experience and the struggles of borrowers, especially when we put these racial disparities in mind. And so I really think, again, going back to what I said in the beginning, a lot of these racial disparities in this crisis are what we see are resulting from longstanding discrimination, but they're also exacerbating that same systemic discrimination. I'm sorry, struggling with our words there. And so I really think it's important for us to both tackle this crisis as a consumer protection crisis, a civil rights crisis. And so when we talk a little bit later about what do these solutions look like, thinking about it twofold. And so so I'm really excited to talk a little bit more in the discussion later about what we think some of the solutions are. And I know there's a really broad world too of other abuses that we see in this industry that disproportionately impact communities of color and borrowers of color. But so I know I didn't touch a lot on for-profit abuses or what we describe as educational redlining or even other predatory practices that we might see in the industry. But hopefully there'll be time to touch on that later. But I'm just super excited to hear more about what Winston and Luke have to say, and I'm just super excited to dig into this conversation.
Thank you, Kat. Winston, do you want to speak now?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks, Kat. Thanks to the whole Brooklyn Law team for putting this together and inviting us. And it's great to be up here, or virtually up here, right, with Kat and Luke to talk about this. Like Kat, I want to find a balance between not bearing the lead, but also putting everything up front, right? We're going to have a conversation. So I'll just try to build off some of what she said. I think she said a really great foundation. Actually, let me do 2 things first. I think, we're all lawyers on here. I have to do a little official throat clear. So all the views I might express today are my own and not necessarily those of the government office I work for, or New York State generally. And then to also sort of re-up my intro. So I work at the State Department of Services, And that's our state's financial regulator. So what a financial regulator is, just take a quick second here, is it for some financial service providers, loan servicers, lenders, money transmitters. We also do insurance, but that's not so on point for this conversation. To do business in the state of New York, you either need a license, you need to come in and get officially credentialed, or you need to comply with certain rules of the road. So either way, we, in partnership with the CFPB, where Kat used to work in some other federal offices at DFS, my agency, we more or less set the rules of the road for financial actors with respect to how they do business in New York, and make sure they aren't engaging in consumer harms. And when they do engage in consumer harms, we do investigations and enforcement and try to remedy that. Plenty to be said on that on maybe another call or panel, or had a chance to join a class earlier this semester. But that's more or less what DFS does. And about a year and a half ago, we got licensing authority over student loan servicers, which is sort of what brought me to DFS. So now we license, which if you take a step back, is sort of a shocking thing. It means until fall of 2019, Navient, Nelnet, all these guys who do your month-to-month payments were more or less unregulated, right? And so New York is still in the minority of states in terms of officially regulating and licensing these significant actors in the student loan space. There are some general consumer protections that apply to all financial actors and all folks who engage in sort of commerce and transactions with consumers, but you need to have some fine-tuned rules, right? Especially for something as consequential as student loan servicers, since Kat laid out the sort of student loan landscape. So licensing student loans is a means of regulating that industry. And we could have an entire separate conversation, and maybe we should, right, about licensing student loan servicers and the trend that specifically Student Borrower Protection Center, Kat's organization, is really leading the charge on states taking up this mantle and doing this work, which is traditionally a state sort of police power role, consumer protection role anyway, which is not to say the federal government shouldn't be involved. And I think we're about to see a much more re-engaged and robust federal actor in this space. But that's an important function that DFS plays in New York on this topic. And my role as a student loan advocate or ombudsperson there is both to help field consumer complaints, and I'll work with our team that does that with respect to the servicer, but also more generally to be the person at our financial regulator who thinks about student loan issues. And I really love that position because it's not just about servicing. It's about, as Kat mentioned, educational redlining. Are people getting loans, but it depends on what school they go to, and are they getting more expensive loans based on where they live or what they look like? Alternative, you might want to call it financial financing products, right? Is something a loan? Is it not a loan? Is it novel? How does a regulator approach that? Is it harming people? So there's a lot to be said about that as well. Obviously, with the student loan issue, the vast majority of the debt, about 90%, is federal student debt, right? That means the federal government either originated or guaranteed at some level. There's a whole history there as well, but it's a federal program, right? So there's preemption immediately when you come into federal program territory. And that doesn't mean states don't have a role, and states are actively taking space to make sure they do have a role there. But there are some currently litigated borders and sort of demarcations between the federal space and the student and the state space with respect to student loans. So when we talk about cancellation of student loan debt, which is a very critical, and I think Luke has a long history on this concept, but a critical part of the student loan sort of justice conversation, it is almost all with respect to federal policy. Now, that doesn't mean states shouldn't have a voice and an opinion, and I sort of want to walk through in a moment what I view to be some of the interesting issues around student loan debt cancellation. But I also want to call attention to all of the private student loan debt, which is the minority part of it. It's about 10%, give or take, and is almost certainly not going to be subject to any level of federal loan relief. I mean, there is a world in which the federal government uses federal dollars to pay down its private student loan. It's probably an even less likely world because of contract laws and all sorts of other things, in the legal world, that the federal government would otherwise intervene in the private contract relationship between private lenders and borrowers. But all that is to say, private student loans are probably not going to go away in this legislative cycle the way that we might see a change through executive authority or legislation in Congress about the federal student loan landscape. Also, private student loans don't have most of the, if not any of the protections that are built into federal student loans. Now, those protections, and we'll talk about this today, are mostly not working well, right? So I think there are some serious problems with the federal machinery with respect to federal student loan debt, but they're there and they're enforceable and they're litigated, and they're being litigated by some very brilliant lawyers right now. Private student loan space, it's significantly less borrower friendly with respect to protections. And states are also with the support of the Student Borrower Protection Center, rethinking how at the state level for new origination of private student loans, they can build in some more protections like that. And that's a really interesting trend that's going on right now. But servicers, to go a little bit full circle on myself, are relevant for federal and private student loan debt, right? So I think there's a lot of focus on servicers, states licensing servicers, putting servicing protections into place. And when you work in the public interest law, public interest world, there is always this sort of, I'm trying to put myself out of business mentality, right? Like I want to solve these problems and I don't want to have the job I have because the job I have is about fixing a problem in someone's life. Even if the federal student debt problem goes away, I'm still going to have a job. Kat's probably still going to have a job. Luke's probably still going to have a job with respect to this because there is this significant private student loan situation. So again, without wanting to sort of get into everything now, I thought that what I would do, and this might be a good transition over into some of what Luke does and wants to talk about, is some of the cancellation, dig into some of the cancellation topics and policy maybe you've maybe heard about or read about. It's a little bit outside of what DFS currently does, my organization, my agency, because again, it's a federal issue, but I think it's important to take every opportunity to like proselytize, I guess, or sort of speak truth to power if you can. So I think if you think about student loan debt as a racial justice issue, which I do, you're sort of already on the same page that there are like significant reasons why we should engage in student loan debt cancellation. I wanted to highlight a couple other ones, and the racial justice component I think we'll talk about on this panel, and Kat really already started to get into about the disparities there, the wealth gaps, how they compound each other, et cetera. Student loan servicers play a huge role in that, not to make another plug, right? If you're getting poor servicing advice, your loan's going to balloon and balloon and balloon. You're not going to get in the right program. You'll find out 10 years into PSLF, public student loan forgiveness, that you were in the wrong repayment plan on some technicality, and you have to start from scratch. But I think there are some other policy justifications other than racial justice, right? And they're all mutually supportive. This is not a zero-sum situation, but I think everyone, it's like pick your poison, right? Like some fiscal hawks will take to something in the way that civil rights advocates will take to another thing, and we can all come to the same place. So in addition to the racial justice, which we'll circle back to, I think there is like an efficiency judgment also, right? So we talked about default. So the majority of folks who default or don't on their loans actually owe, it's counterintuitive, but they owe less than $10,000. This is often because these students or former students might be what's called non-completers. They didn't finish the education they took out money for, which means they have the debt, but not the income earning potential of a graduate who has a degree or certification. So that leaves them in a really difficult position. Average debt load for the person in that situation is typically less than $10,000. So if we're talking about $10,000 debt cancellation, you're immediately addressing a significant portion of the delinquent population. And it varies state to state, but and also I feel like you'll see these numbers vary by 1 or 2 percentage points, but let's say like 10% of borrowers are delinquent or in default. I think in New York State, it's a little bit above 10. So that's one justification, right? Like these are people who we know are having problems. They're identifiable population. We know how they got here. And if the financing was supposed to get an education and the education didn't work out, these are public programs, right? Like that's actually maybe a really important backdrop. These are public programs, right? This is like and I saw a really great, my former colleague up at Massachusetts did a good explainer video a couple weeks ago. Like if I loan Kat $20 and I'm the federal government, like I can sort of dictate the terms of repayment, including non-repayment, right? So let's just remember that this is really a two-party transactional conversation, the federal government and the borrower. So you could say, you know what, Kat's down on her luck, she didn't get the degree. I'm just going to choose to not have her pay me back the $20, right? So that's in the realm of possible. Another justification is the programs that we have for debt cancellation aren't working the way they're meant to work. So let's just cancel in the spirit of those programs. You can go in a little bit more tactically and say, we have program cancellation for borrower defense where your school ripped you off. We have program cancellation for if you're totally and permanently disabled. We have program cancellation for if your school closes, debt cancellation for if your school closes, if you do public service loan forgiveness. All of these are phenomenally underperforming programs, right? There are problems without. So there's a justification for the spirit, if not the letter of the law, though I think it's both in this case, to cancel on the basis of existing programs if you really wanted to, if you didn't want to have a broader categorical. You could be a technocrat, right? This is, if you're not a civil rights person, maybe you're a technocrat, maybe you're both, pick your poison. Economic justifications is a huge drag on the economy and household wealth building, and all these other things that Kat also mentioned. Pandemic relief frees up cash, keeps in the pocket of people. They can pay their utilities, they can pay their rent. We're going to have a huge housing cliff problem in a couple of weeks, if not months. So it deals with that. equity throughout the system. It's harder to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy than it is other debts. We can sort of recalibrate a little bit by saying we're just going to engage in cancellation, if not amend the bankruptcy code to allow for more equitable and just bankruptcy discharge. And then another one, which is, and I'm going to sort of wrap up here. I have other sort of things that I thought could be like a myth busters. Like people say, like, what about this with cancellation? But it's like, not what about this, you know? One example of that is I think people are very focused on that broad cancellation or robust cancellation would be, help like wealthy and white college graduates, right? So why would we do this? And I think the short answer there is that first of all looks at a dollar cancellation, like a percentage of the outstanding debt, not at the people that would be benefited. So you might say, oh, if we cancel 50% of $50,000 across the board, that's going to wind up being X percentage of the 1.7 trillion, and that helps white people. But it's, first of all, it's okay to help white people. It's like, let's look at people's individual circumstances. But I think what that critique misses is that there might be significantly more people who have lower dollar amounts. So they represent a smaller portion of the debt being forgiven, but are just a large group of people. Also, there's like a cynical, I think, belief in there that you need to have a lot of people for the help to be worth it, right? You can do something that's helpful even if it doesn't impact a large community of people. And then the final thing I'll say on the why else should we justify, what are the other justifications for cancellation? And then I'll, looking forward to the rest of the conversation is, and this is something that a professor, Trustee McMillan Cottom, who's a very good speaker on public for-profit schools and higher ed debt and things like this, said, like, this is sort of like our bad or like a whoops, like 30 or 40 years of higher ed policy. Like the experiment may have failed. Like the experiment in higher ed debt and government lending for education may not have worked out the way it intended. And so it's incumbent on the actor that created the system and gave out the loans and made the programs to clean that up, not let the borrowers who were the downstream actors in the system sort of carry the bag going forward. So I think that's a really succinct way of also justifying why we should engage in sort of racial justice oriented higher debt cancellation and dramatic sort of reconfiguration, is because the government did something, it ended up harming more people than it intended to. Not that it ever intends to harm people, but inadvertently harmed a lot of people. And so the government also has a responsibility to make right on that. So I'll pause there to make sure I don't keep sort of going on and on, but looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Winston. That was really great. And then Luke.
Thanks, Cam. And thanks, VJ, for inviting me and us. Thanks, Kat and Winston, for setting this up very nicely. I especially appreciate Kat going through some statistics. I hate going through statistics, but it's so important to put that stuff on the table because it really does set the table in a precise, but also a impactful way. So I guess what I want to do, I don't want to take too much time because I'm eager to answer questions folks have, but I want to talk about two things. One is I want to zoom out because I think it can get easy to get stuck in the weeds here and talk about why should we have student debt at all? And what is our positive vision for higher education? And then I want to talk a little bit about cancellation, the sort of techniques of cancellation. So with respect to the former, I don't think there's any reason to have student debt. And I think the way the conversation often happens is student debt is presumed legitimate because that's the system we have. And so the burden of proof is on the person who thinks that student debt should be canceled to prove that each marginal amount of student debt needs to be canceled. But I think it's important to at least consider what a shifted burden of proof looks like. What is the positive justification for student debt? And I think the main justification is it makes education affordable in a way. So, okay, but there's a lot of ways to make education affordable. So how does student debt do that in a particular way? Well, the notion is, one, it shares burdens in some way, right? And two, if it's designed in the right way, it can have people who are from relatively better off backgrounds cross-subsidizing people from worse off backgrounds. But as far as I can tell, the way that argument cashes out is always a better argument for making higher education free for anyone who wants higher education and having a good progressive income tax to make sure that inequality, to reduce inequality and to manage budgetary impact. And it's important to think about student debt, I think, as playing not just to think about student debt as just another item on individuals' balance sheets, it's important to think about it in that way because it's a big impact in people's lives and communities' lives as a money suck. And it's a highly unequal money suck, as Kat and Winston properly emphasized. But thinking in the aggregate, it's also deeply corrupting to the way higher education works and to how people understand what it does and to how people understand themselves and their relationship to work and a whole number of things. So let me just say a couple things about that. And I think the best way to sort of tease that out is to think historically about student debt. Student debt is a US invention. And it was not really an intentional invention of the higher education system. It was, for the first part of the 20th century, it's not an exaggeration. I mean, it's only a bit of an oversimplification to say that the role of higher education was understood to be as part of the process of expanding access to opportunity and equalizing incomes, primarily on a racialized basis. There's a lot of exclusionary mechanisms, both in the labor market and in higher education, that restricted a lot of the benefits of higher education to white people and especially white men. And this, white actually had a narrower definition there. So plenty of schools didn't let in Jews, for instance. But the way it was understood was as a mutually reinforcing set of good things. We should have strong labor markets with strong unions that have relatively equalized pay scales. And then we should have people who are getting good educations to go into to do good work to make their lives better. And that should be publicly provided, higher education. And it's important to remember, of course, that high school was not mandatory or free until the first part of the 20th century. So it was actually only relatively recently after that people started to go to higher education. So how did student debt creep into this? Well, basically by accident. Basically, student debt was meant to fill a couple gaps in the Higher Education Act of 1965. And then collective commitment to providing free higher education for everybody waned over time. And the degree to which it waned was, it actually remained at a relatively stable level in terms of total expenditures, but the relative cost of education went up over time and collective investment in education did not catch up. So student loans were left to fill the gap, right? So imagine like public expenditures are here, cost of providing higher education goes up for reasons that we can talk about if you want. And then what's this? It's just the federal commitment to provide loans to fill that gap. The problem, what happens when that happened is a couple things. One is that happens just at the time when a lot of colleges start to integrate. So it has a highly racially unequal impact. And that's a way of thinking about this, like the burdens that were talked about earlier in a sort of static dimension as a part of a dynamic that happened over time, right? There's racial exclusion at time one, then there's inclusion at time two, but it's what some sociologists have referred to as predatory inclusion, right? Now we're going to let people from previously disadvantaged backgrounds come into higher education, but we're going to, I kind of want to use the curse word, we're going to mess it up. We're going to make it bad, not as good and highly unequal, right? So this is the era also of when for-profit colleges start to take a much bigger role. And when a lot of public colleges stop committing to providing free education. So anyway, what is the effect of that? I think it's worth thinking about. One of the effects of that is the sort of distributional impacts that we just talked about. People's balance sheets are all messed up, right? And that's also because of shifts in the labor market, which we can talk about. But another set there's a couple other set of things. One is that people increasingly view higher education. When I say people, I mean people who go to schools, people who are administrators at schools, people who do policy about higher education, as human capital. What that means is it's an investment in your future employability, an investment in your future ability to earn income, right? And that was not the dominant way of talking about higher education or thinking about higher education until really the 1990s, when student debt really started to take off, right? Because the felt reality of higher education is this is really expensive. The only way I can justify doing this is if I make a lot of money afterwards because of it. And it so happened that due to shifts in the labor market that highly favored educational credentials over that period of time, right? The importance of educational credentials wasn't that important in the first part of the 20th century. Because of those shifts, suddenly that becomes much more important, such that it now appears that higher education is naturally an investment in wages. And that corrupts how people understand education. That changes what people major in. That changes how people think about what the value of education is. Why, history is like severely underinvested, even though that like now is the time we need to think about our history more than ever. The arts are severely underinvested, et cetera. And administrators increasingly basically view themselves primarily as financial administrators. They, of big schools, they run these huge investments with hedge funds, they engage with more time with donors, and they don't think about education all that much, right? Meanwhile, the Department of Education, the main job of the Department of Education is collecting from students, is a debt collector, right? Is managing a financial portfolio of one of the largest forms of consumer debt. And why, that's a Department of Education? That's not education, right? So it's worth thinking about the deeper structural aspects of student loans, which is not just student loans per se, right? It's the policies that produce them, right? But and so I think anyway, there's a lot more to say there, but that's one way of thinking about the depth and the scope of the problem, and thinking about recommitting to providing higher education on terms that are equal, and that have an effect that changes the way people understand education, that changes the relationship of education to the labor market. Of course, labor market reforms would also be required. Let me just say a couple words about what student debt cancellation means in terms of legality, since I think that's probably one of the reasons I was asked here. So I've argued, and some people seem to think I'm right. Nobody has a really strong challenge yet, that as Winston said, the Department of Education, as part of its discretionary authority over the federal student loan portfolio, can just write off federal student loans. There's some legal details with respect to the different loan programs. For instance, the FFEL program, Federal Family Education Loan Program, and the Perkins program are different than the direct loan program. Almost, the folks here probably just have direct loans, so you don't have to think that much about that. But in terms of the broader scope of the portfolio, that matters. That's something that is now, I guess, somewhat mainstream. Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren are pushing for Biden to instruct Secretary Cardona to do that. Biden has been coy so far. So I'm happy to talk about that a lot more. But as Winston said, that's just for federal student loans. That's not for private student loans. It doesn't, just canceling student loans obviously doesn't solve the problem, right? So if it happens through the executive branch, you're not going to get, the executive branch can't also provide additional funding to colleges to make them free to not produce debt in the future, right? It would have to be just canceling student debt. And there could be, by the way, a whole number, the way I think of it is, as Winston said, quoting Tressie, it is a whoops, we need to I've talked about it as in terms of a policy reset. Would have to come with a whole other different scope of policy resets, just like not funding for-profit colleges anymore, being much more careful about funding vocational schools that are nonprofit colleges, having a much more effective public service loan forgiveness program, et cetera, until we get to the point where we don't have student loans. There's plenty to do in the Department of Education. But the other point I would make is that, that's like legal trickery, but Congress can always do this. Congress can cancel private student loans. In fact, that was part of the Bernie Sanders' proposed bill, his little draft legislation that he put out during his presidential campaign, with Elizabeth Warren, I think during the early part of the campaign. They could just cancel it. they could just say, this is, you don't have, nobody has to pay this anymore. Also, college is free, right? And I just want to point out that that would actually really not be that much money. Some estimates say it's like $80 million a year or $80 billion a year, which is like a drop in the bucket of the federal budget and would be so beneficial to so many people. And it would also, I'll say this at the end, open up space for rethinking about what higher education can be and how we can use institutions of higher education. If the federal government starts funding higher education directly for everybody who wants it or needs it, now we can start to think about public colleges not as places that have to cut budgets and be creative about how to do spending, but rather as anchor institutions in communities that provide education for students, that provide employment for academics, who can do unpopular research, who can think about things that other people aren't thinking about, who can develop vaccines for the next potential pandemic. But also as spaces that provide medical services, legal services, arts, sanctuary to members of the community nearby. These are big institutions that have all kinds of educated people with all kinds of skills that are not like highly marketable. I mean, they're useful skills, but they're not necessarily skills that can produce a lot of returns in the market. And this is something that funding can subsidize, right? Can provide a lot of useful things that communities need, that we need, that the market isn't going to provide. So anyway, that's the end of my little portion.
Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing those insights. So before we turn it over to the audience for questions, I think we just have one kind of broad policy question. So given the Biden administration's proposal, what does $10,000 of federal loan forgiveness for an individual accomplish in the long term when we consider kind of the mounting economic losses related to the pandemic and how the student debt crisis has kind of stymied access to the middle class in ways that have exacerbated the racial wealth gap?
Go ahead, Kat.
Okay, I was like, I don't know who wants to jump in first, but I'll just be really brief. I know you're talking about 10K, but I'll just push one other plug for 50K. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but it seems I think we're all, at least in our personal to the and professional capacities, pushing for a higher amount. But one thing I want to emphasize, and I think Winston touched on this in talking about with a 10K number in terms of like reaching many like struggling borrowers in terms of like defaulted borrowers who may not have completed a program, whether they couldn't finish for some reason, whether they went to like a predatory for-profit school, like whatever reason. But there's a bucket of borrowers who would benefit, who have relatively small balances. But I would want to point out the other point when we think about even the equity case for a larger amount of debt. I know sometimes I think Winston brought up the case where people are like, well, is there really a racial equity case for like canceling 50K? Who is that really helping? But I also think, and part of the reason why I really wanted to like frame up this conversation in terms of, the racial wealth gap and racial equity is because when I was talking earlier about like that intergenerational cycle of people borrowing money and then that cutting into wealth creation is really understanding, especially for communities that have less wealth, that income is not the same thing as wealth. And so like you could have borrowers who may say, yes, you did go to law school, you got the job, you're working, but if you have debt and then you're trying to pay that down, like how does that affect your ability again to buy a home, to start a business? How much more are you paying for credit because you have more debt? And so really thinking about how all of those things are still stripping wealth and impeding people from being able to create more wealth. And so there's an understanding that broad cancellation would still help a large class of people and a large class of, sometimes we don't think about it in that way in terms of like, especially for like Black and Latino communities, when we're thinking about what does income mean versus wealth in terms of cancellation. So just like a brief thought there, and I'll stop rambling if Winston and Luke want to jump in.
Do you want to go? I can follow up.
Go ahead, Mr. Noel. Yeah.
I agree, and I just have a couple numbers, but this is like, let me stress, back of the envelope level math that I did in advance based on some Department of Education. They published their portfolio, their loan portfolio data, and I just was curious and I went in. So canceling $10,000 right now for the department held portfolio, again, this gets into some bucketing, would be about $75 billion and 15.5 million people. So that's around 5% of the debt, but 33% of borrowers. If you take it up to $20,000, $20,000 cancellation per person of department held loans, it's about $208 billion or 13% of the debt, but $208 billion, 13% of the debt, but 24.5 million people, or about 53% of the borrowers, half the people, right? So if you go from 10 to 20, you're looking at half of the ed held loan borrowers no longer having debt. And if you go up to 60, because I don't know where we got this 50. There's like it's hard for me to find that, like, anyway, if the department publishes it.
I think it was this expert study that Warren commissioned. Unfortunately, she was committed to doing less than full cancellation, and they came up with this somewhat arbitrary number that was supposed to be maximizing racial equity. But of course, that's been amended since, because the numbers change every year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even like they change every year, change every quarter. If you really want to get like nerd out on this, there are not a lot of numbers to look at. But if you cancel 60, you're looking at $60,000 per borrower. You're looking at 43% of the debt, but 84% of the borrowers. Like, so I think to Kat's point, like, you can definitely hit. And also there are some different studies out there, but one says that 54% of the debt is held by the lowest wealth quintile, right? So if you start to sort of put all these together, you can see that it's the lowest wealth households, as Kat put it, not income necessarily, who have a disproportionate amount of debt. So any level of cancellation benefits them, and there's racial justice things there. And then one related thing I wanted to say to build off what Luke had finished on earlier is, again, taking a step back and thinking about what's really going on here. Like, why is the Department of Education operating as basically the largest commercial bank, right? Like, why is that what it's doing? But also, what do we actually mean when we say $1.7 trillion? That's not just like principal and interest from the day you originated. That is a lot of interest that through ed offered programs meant to help people through something called negative amortization and capitalization creates a balloon of interest you wouldn't have planned to pay that then capitalizes into the principal, and you start earning interest on interest. So I couldn't find the numbers because I was sort of in a rush today, but some folks have broken that down. When we say 1.7 trillion, first of all, how much of that is like unintended interest? How much of that is interest that the government actually induced you into accruing? But then also, as with every debt collector, the Department of Education does not expect to collect on all of that debt. They have internally said pennies on the dollar is what we've planned to get back. So when we say how much does debt cancellation cost, even if we did full cancellation, it wouldn't cost $1.7 billion. First of all, it wouldn't cost me. Money is like a total fiction, and that's another panel too, I think. But it's like, this is the government. They shouldn't think about money the way that like Luke, Kat, or I think about money and pay our bills, right? It's just completely different. But they're not actually losing $1.7 billion because they have already budgeted for not collecting $1.7 billion. So even if on the most conservative fiscal sense, they're losing like whatever percentage of that they planned to actually recoup. So I just wanted to make that point in terms of Luke's like really take a step back and think about what we're talking about. It's not as simple as it's 1.7 billion, so it costs 1.7 billion.
Let me just say something really briefly, which is just, I know some folks that were on this call with like Biden staff, and somebody from Debt Collective, who does a lot of research on these student debt numbers, where does this $10,000 come from? What's your justification for that? And they said, we don't know. So I think that's, in a certain sense, that's your answer.
Luke, it's a good headline. It's an even number. You just say 10,000.
It's less than 50,000.
Yeah.
You see how this works?
Okay, so now if anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand.
Joe.
Hey guys, thanks for coming and doing this panel, first of all. And I don't know if I have a question. I think I'm just going to say things and then add a what do you think at the end of it. But one concern that I have, I think the biggest concern that I have with a sort of blanket forgiveness at sort of any level is that to me, there's like different sort of equity issues with different with different origins of debt. So like people who went to DeVry or people who went to Corinthians colleges, all these like for-profit colleges that are like vocational schools that gave basically useless degrees seem qualitatively different in, you know, thinking about justice and forgiveness than like other forms of debt for people who went to schools that were, you know, legitimate. And so I'm wondering, like, you know, with the new Biden administration, like if there's any conversation around that, because I think that's really important. And then a second thing that I want to say real quick is even for these borrowers, like what would be the effectiveness of canceling like some portion of debt when it's very unlikely that they're going to pay the rest of the principal, right? So say someone went to Corinthians and has $40,000 in debt from Corinthians and got just like a total BS degree that's for like a medical assistant, but nobody really recognizes it. And then there's 10K forgiveness and now they have $30,000 in debt. And they're like, great, I still can't pay that. So those are two issues that, you know, I think about, and I wonder what you guys have to say about that.
Can I start? All right, I'm just going to really quickly on one of them. I think that on a practical standpoint, you have to think about what you want to do on the first part of your question, right? If the goal is to help people who need help by canceling their debt, you need to make it as broad as possible, because the second you start narrowing it in, and this is, I think, coming from a place where the three of us probably support complete cancellation, right? Or like extraordinarily high levels of cancellation. But if you're not going to just do that, the more specific you make it, the higher the barriers to entry are, and the less likely it is the people that you intend to get the relief will get the relief. And we see this as a case in point currently with the TPD, total permanent disability discharge, right? A population of people based on their ability to work, we're told, will cancel your debt, but the government made it too onerous for that population that has inherently some barrier to some day-to-day practical tasks to apply and get it, right? So if you strap on conditions of varying points, procedural or eligibility, significantly fewer of the target people who you want to help are going to get that relief. So broader is the better policy solution, even if you don't think that like everyone deserves it, so to speak. It's hard to talk about this without like value-laden language, but I think we can just all sort of stipulate to be kind to each other on that front. So broader is better on that front, I think. And I guess I'll stop there because I know we're time sensitive and I want to let the other folks get in and or get more questions.
I'll just say very briefly, like, of course, somebody who has a degree that's worthless is in a worse situation and deserves restitution, but they also deserve more than debt cancellation. They deserve damages. I mean, that's fraud. So, you know, in any case, you know, so I think those are like two somewhat separate issues, and like they can potentially be, whether those are separate issues that are map onto like the remedies that can be provided is maybe a contingent question, but it just so happens that they could actually, except for like arbitration clauses and bankruptcy of those schools. I think that's all I'll say.
I have a question.
Um,
I think
great,
that
yeah, go for it.
arguably all degrees are useless. But however, I think that I'm stuck on the phrase, whoever wants to go to higher education can go to higher education. I think that in a lot of ways, a bachelor's degree has become mandatory. So if you want to in basket weaving, you can get in basket weaving, but a bachelor's degree itself has become mandatory for a lot of things. And I think that's missing from this conversation. Like, do you think that it's mandatory or not?
But by mandatory, you mean, you know, you can't like live a decent
support
life.
yourself with a bachelor's degree in America.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a real problem. I mean, and that has to do with like a lot of shifts that happened in the labor market that made it just harder to get a good job, which one just in itself is going to make it a more competitive thing. And to the extent that, you know, that education sorts people and there's only so many people that can get a job that's well remunerated, it has that effect. There's also the fact that those jobs have shifted into like that usually require some high level of, you know, math or detailed textual analysis, which actually does require additional education. But though, we can change that. We can change how we structure the workplace. That's not really higher education policy, but that would have a huge effect on the value of education. And I still think that everybody who wanted an education, and in fact, I think in that circumstance, it's even more important because then education isn't just to get a job. So I think that's right, but I don't necessarily know whether that speaks to the question about the justice of providing people education. I mean, maybe it makes it more incumbent that we provide people education to the extent that we make the labor market organized in that way.
So this is really rich and stimulating. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time left. I know Luke may have to go and others may have to go. I'm gonna ask one more question. But I really want to thank our three speakers and our Sparrow Fellows for putting on a really amazing event. And the last question comes from Professor Jones-Wooden, and it's what can students and professors do to help?
Just a really quick one. One thing is events like this, or just even calling attention to this crisis, I keep saying think, but even where we were a year ago talking about, debt cancellation, I know we're kind of like breaking down like whether we're like in support of full cancellation, 50K, 10K, all those conversations, but the fact that this is part of our national conversation, when a year ago, we were just kind of like screaming into the wind. But I think that one thing is just really calling attention to this issue and really talking about it, especially connecting it to why is this an equity issue? Why do we need to be talking about this? Why, if we're going to talk about any kind of economic justice, if we're going to talk about any kind of economic recovery, student debt has to be central to that. And so I think the more that we have those conversations and elevate it, I think that's a really important part of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that understanding sort of the different backdrops and coming to terms with how you feel about it, not just thinking of it as like a dollar amount that's changing in someone's budget book, but also there's like the classic, and not to be under, whatever, call your local congressman. If you're in New York State, great. If you're not from New York State, even better. Start expressing this as something that you think your representatives in Washington should be taking seriously. And then finally, I think this is super granular, but is also important. When you see something wrong, we're in New York, see something, say something. Come to me and my agency and file a complaint against your servicer if they did something wrong. Build a body of evidence. We're all on this call, either lawyers or aspiring lawyers or work with lawyers. There is something to be said for the collective singularity, right? So if you have an experience, help add it to the larger conversation. And that can be about your servicer, as I mentioned, or it can be, hey, I just realized I have maybe a loan that has an unlawful interest rate, or I feel like I got a loan rate that's not the same as what it should be, et cetera. So don't think that your experience can't change the outcome and can't be outcome determinative, and add it to the mix.
Okay, great. So I want to really thank Winston, Kat, Luke, who's gone, Cameron, Zachary, Raina for putting on an amazing lunch session. And we can continue this conversation offline. So if you're interested in any of these issues, contact one of the Sparrow Fellows who put this on, contact me, and we'll pass along Luke, Kat, and Winston's contact if they're comfortable with it. And I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your questions. So let's thank everyone, and I will see you all later.
And just to note, Luke's email address is in the chat, so if people didn't see that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay,
Please pass my contact on.
Thank you.